Tom Ashcraft. Know most of you. If you don't know who I am, I'm Tom Ashcraft. I'm the director of the MFA program here. And today we have a good fortune of having Kimberly English as our guest artist. Kimberly currently divides her time right now between Canton, just up the road, and Richmond, where she is currently a WCU emerging artist. She has a emerging artist fellowship in craft material studies at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond for the full year. Kimberly received her undergraduate degree from Savannah College of Art and Design in textiles, MFA from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in studio art as the Carolina Digital Humanities Fellow. She graduated with the MFA in 2018. And she's been really busy. We actually met at, just after the finishing of your Bascom Center for Art residency. That was that in 23? And I've been curious in following her work and just watching it get better and better. So this is it's really great to have you here. She's shown, exhibited widely in the States and internationally. Spartanburg Museum of Art, the New Bedford Art Museum, Delaware Center for Contemporary Art, which is a great place, by the way. Auckland Museum, and am I pronouncing this right? The Zong Institute of Contemporary Art in Korea. Is that the right place? Okay, it's the wrong place. Anyway, and Museum of Craft and Design. Number of residencies, which include the Woodstock Byrdcliffe Artist Colony, University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, the Bascom, which I mentioned, Praxis Digital Weaving Lab. She's had multiple shows. Berea College, a solo exhibition, Appalachian Center for Craft, Print and Pattern at Blue Spiral Gallery in Asheville. Was Wingate Emerging Fellow in Fiber at, I already mentioned that. Penland Winter Residency, Vermont School of Arts and Crafts, and been busy. So we're really glad to have you here, and join me in welcoming Kimberly English. Should work.
Second one down.
30 minutes.
Oh, someone's happening. Okay.
Okay, good.
How's that? Fine, right? Okay. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Kimberly English, and I am really grateful to spend some time with you today. I'm really going to focus on talking about my most recent body of work, and then towards the end I'm going to kind of work back chronologically. I am originally from Middle Georgia, and a lot of my work, especially recently, deals with growing up in the South and living in Southern Appalachia. And I currently, like Tom said, split my time between Richmond and Canton, North Carolina, where I live with my husband and a bunch of chickens and a bunch of animals. Yeah, so right now I feel like I'm kind of living this double life where I'm like in the city during the week and in the country during the weekend. But yeah, I'm grateful to be able to spend some time with y'all today talking about this work that is really informed by the land that we share here in Appalachia. My practice is fiber-based. Some of the work I'm going to show today utilizes found objects and wood, but my kind of tether to making is in fiber, specifically weaving. I went to undergrad thinking I was going to be an advertising major, LOL, and all of my professors were like, girl, this is not it. And I kind of kept getting pulled aside by many professors saying, like, you really have this sensibility for pattern and texture and like interrogating how systems interact with one another. And I took a weaving class and it was kind of game over. That was really kind of where I found my my foot in the door towards my more serious making discipline. I really fell in love with weaving because of its accessibility. I like that you can weave on a big fancy floor loom, but you can also quilt on your lap while you're watching television, outside, in the car. That is really one of the things that struck me about fiber first. I also think thinking historically about its role as a domestic craft, specifically related to quote-unquote women's work, and kind of the signifier of the working class is really what attracted me conceptually to the discipline. And I also think that fiber is this kind of primal, instinctual magnet for humans. We are naturally drawn to it. And I think that it's kind of this Trojan horse in talking about really powerful things surrounding the human condition, like culture, like the body, and like the systems that we operate in. The three kind of main themes in my work that I'm going to focus on talking about today are interdependence, the hand, and loss. I'm really interested in the relationship between the individual and the collective and how systems work together. So how we have relationships with one another, with the land, with the objects that we make, with the machines that we use. And recently I've been kind of working on this idea in a couple of different ways, what the hand looks like in craft, specifically what's done by machines and what's done by labor with our bodies. And the last big idea is loss. I think for a long time I talked about absence as being this really important part of my work, but as I dig a little deeper, I think the more accurate term is loss, that there is this desire here, or this thing that once was, that has been taken away. So all of those themes lead me to introducing my most recent body of work that is titled Threshold, that was just installed at East Tennessee State University Slocum Galleries. And the title of this work, Threshold, is multifaceted, but it is drawn directly from Sally Mann's memoir, Hold Still, which if you haven't read, I couldn't recommend it more. It is really this beautiful love letter to Appalachia, and it's a lot about grief and growth and kind of this relationship that Sally Mann has with the land that she's working from. This work is really related to that book, but even more so it's related to my father. There is this point in the book, there's this chapter where she's talking about the experience of losing your family, or losing your parents. And I'm gonna paraphrase this, but she has this quote where she says, "You spend your whole life with your back up against the door trying to keep your parents out. And then in an instant, the threshold collapses and you spend the rest of your life picking up the splinters." And I really can't think of a better way to describe what the last year, after my estranged father unexpectedly passed. This book was kind of this revelation of what this body of work was going to look like. Just a little bit of a background on my father. He was always a tinkerer, and my memory of him growing up was getting home from work and immediately going to his wood shop and tinkering with things, with material, and figuring out how things worked together. And he was deeply obsessed with material and process, and I never admitted this whenever he was still living, but I know now that if I did not see his practice, then I would not have a creative discipline. Also, thinking about our relationship, just to give you a little bit of a backstory, we were always in opposition to each other, very much a binary system, which I also think weaving makes sense to talk about this relationship. He was a neo-Confederate, and my family was very evangelical growing up, and as I got older, our relationship became slowly estranged due to events, but also due to just recognition of different value systems. And our really complicated, hard relationship is something that I really never talked about when I was younger, which I do realize the irony in giving this very public lecture now about this very private relationship. But I think that idea, public and private, and kind of where those things overlap, is something that comes up a lot in my work in general. When I was doing research for this show with kind of investigating how grief has been written about over the last couple of centuries, I really found that grief and mourning in the pre-industrial world was really not treated as this private experience. It was much more public. And my favorite anecdote to illustrate this is there was what was called mourning stationery, where when you were writing to your loved ones after you had experienced a death of someone in your life, you would write on a corresponding note card that demonstrated your grief at that time. So when you were in the throes of your grief, you would write on this note card that had this very inky black thick border. And then as time went on, that border would shrink, and it was kind of at the forefront of that communication that you were having. And I think there's something to us now in the 21st century recognizing that grief is not necessarily this linear process, but I also think there's something to that feeling being involved in the conversation. And there's so much writing about grief and that process, and so much theory about catharsis that I am very interested in, academically, scholarly, but I also know that primally, gutturally, this is the only work that I could make this last year. And there are a lot of different processes in this work, some that are very calculated, like weaving, like quilting, but there are some that are literally just wrapping material, because it was this haptic form of healing that for the first time, I think I thought of my practice like that in this last year. I think typically I classify myself as a research-based artist, for better or for worse, and this kind of felt like me shaking that off and just making because I had to. I want to talk about several pieces in the show, and this one is titled "The Stranger in the House." The title for this comes from Bell Hook's The Will to Change, which is a lot about men and masculinity and operating within patriarchal systems, specifically the family. And Bell Hooks tells this story where when she was in college, she calls home after not speaking to her father for many, many months, and her dad picking up the phone and her immediately just asking to speak to her mom. And it's kind of this funny ha-ha story, but it's an illustration of what my relationship was with my father, and I'm sure probably some of you as well. But in that book, she talks about how operating within the patriarchal family unit really prevents the men in those systems from being vulnerable and connecting with the other people in that system. And there kind of becomes this compartmentalization. And I want to talk about the process for this piece because I think that is important in this work. Often, I'm a planner, I'm a very type A person, and some works I make and I don't really have an end goal for them, and this was one of those pieces. I started making it before my father passed in early 2023, and I knew I wanted to make a quilt with a hole in it. That's all I really knew. And then after my dad passed, I was going through his truck and found this flagging tape. That's the fluorescent orange, the border, and then the hanging piece. And I knew that I wanted that to become a part of this piece, kind of thinking about what's visible and what's hidden in these relationships. I also think the obvious connection to me now is that this is a door. Going back to the title of the exhibition, which is Threshold. My father, in addition to being a woodworker, was a construction worker, and he built my childhood home and installed all of the doors. And whenever I was in high school, my parents got their own bedrooms within the house, which had a very profound effect on me, getting to the age where I'm beginning to think about what I want my relationship to look like, what I want my mate to look like. And yeah, I think that compartmentalization, I think, is embodied in this piece whenever I look at it now. Okay, before I talk about this piece, I want to ask you a question. Where you're from, what do you call it when it's raining and the sun is shining at the same time?
The devil is beating his life with
Yes.
a frying pan.
Oh, with a frying pan. Okay, so in Middle Georgia, we just heard the devil is beating his wife. My family would say the devil's spanking his wife. I'm sure many of you have heard this. And this is something that I heard my elementary school teachers say very flippantly. And I think a lot of this work is about the South and kind of contending with my relationship with growing up in the South, and the South not being a lost cause, and wanting to continue the conversation of these cultural moments that I remember. And I wanted to make this piece as a response to that flippant statement. I wanted to ask the question, what about the devil's wife? What does she think about this? And when I began this piece, I was trying to connect the sun and the rain to my parental figures in some way. Like I really wanted to have this like revelation of how they were connected. But I think now I realize that this piece is really kind of this like self-portrait, that despite this like negativity or ugliness, there still is this growth that is happening. And I think that's reflected. There's, so the top and bottom units are, so the orange and the blue, those are woven on what's called a TC2 loom, which I'll show a picture of in just a moment. And the purple sides on the right and the left are quilting repurposed cotton that is quilted using an Appalachian overshot pattern that is called American Bloom, which again I think kind of speaks to this idea of growth amidst this kind of chaos or ugliness. Just thinking a little bit about process, because I realize that some of us may have never even seen a loom, so it's hard to picture how these works were made. On the left is a standard floor loom, which is what I'm typically operating on. And then on the right, this rocket ship is called the TC2 loom. And this has a computer as a part of the loom, and it allows you to operate every thread as a pixel within an image. So you're really able to like draw with thread, which is how the top and bottom pieces of this piece were woven. This piece, the orange and blue stripes, are also TC2 woven. This piece is called Devil's Courthouse Steps, which if anyone has been in this region for a while, you're probably familiar with the Devil's Courthouse hike and tunnel. And you're also probably realizing, whether you've been in this region for a while or not, that I have this thing about putting holes in quilts. And this piece, I wanted to reference this Devil's Courthouse tunnel, but I also wanted to kind of point to this story that I found in my research for this work. There was this woman who lived in what's called Britain's Cove, which is right in my neck of the woods in Canton. And in the 19th century, she really wanted to find a way to get water from the nearby river to her livestock. So she drafted this beautiful pattern, and she made all these blankets out of this pattern. Sold the blankets, and then used that money to pay local men to dynamite the mountain next to her house to reroute the water. And I just think this is the most Appalachian story I've ever heard. And I love it, and I wanted to make this piece about her and about this pattern. So that pattern, the Ferris pattern, it's hard to see in photos, but that is the pattern I used to quilt the big blue kind of cobalt areas in this work. And yeah, I really wanted this piece to kind of be about the land that we occupy and like how we project ourselves onto that land, whether it's violent or peaceful. But yeah, I think this piece and the other works that I've shown kind of have this moment of negative space or deconstruction that's happening, and I find myself keep coming back to the idea of deconstruction or absence in my work that I'm going to talk about a lot today. But I think formally for me, what that process allows me to do is kind of highlight the honesty of the material itself. I think also process-wise, it highlights the labor, and maybe for the viewer as well, kind of reciprocates the labor of the making with the unmaking. And then conceptually, I'm really interested in the relationship between the individual and the collective, like I mentioned at the top, especially within the context of the American South. And I try to find opportunities in my work to kind of isolate specific areas to kind of emphasize the individual components to break the pattern, the structure that's happening in the composition. This work, I know you're not supposed to pick favorites in an exhibition. This is my favorite. I loved working on this piece. I love talking about this piece. And this one is called Through Which to Catch, which is also woven on a TC2 loom, that very fancy loom. And it has a pattern of a net. And after grad school, I started thinking about like personal metaphors and personal imagery, and the net has kind of become this through line in my work, thinking about like the duality of entrapment and nourishment. And growing up in a really religious, very narrow-minded household, I know now that it was for my protection, but it also felt suffocating to be in that environment. So I think, yeah, this net it has kind of continued through the bodies of work that I've made. And I wanted this piece to kind of be a visualization of the grief that I felt like ensnared me for the last year. So this piece is made from cherry wood from my father's shop. A lot of the wood objects that you see are from my father's work, from his collection. And there's kind of this like lashing that's happening with a construction cord that I also found in his truck. The two beads that are suspended are, as far as I know, the only beads that my father made. And they're installed on a partly untwined cord, so in theory they're always kind of in motion with one another. Another net. This piece is called Sour Grapes, which is, the title is taken from scripture in Jeremiah that says, "The fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge." So thinking about like what we inherit, what we choose to inherit from those that came before us. And this piece was also woven on a TC2 loom, and the net that I've made is kind of grafted into the weaving itself. And the compositional element that I was really trying to emphasize here was this kind of space between the nets where there's this simultaneous absence and presence happening, where the weaving is actually starting to unravel a bit. This piece is titled Will versus Weight, and it really takes the basic woven structure of denim, which you see on the right here, and expands it exponentially. I think I'm interested in the idea of like when things fall apart, but I kind of wanted to investigate that from an additive perspective, like how much do I have to expand this pattern for this fabric to not have any structural integrity where it can't be usable. And the twill pattern that you see on the right here, it's a woven structure that's used in everything from our jeans to most uniforms are made out of twill. And I'm gonna kind of circle back and talk about denim a little bit more later. But yeah, I also think that this work is, it feels like skin in a way. It feels like the way that skin sags or as things change over time. This piece is made from wood that I found in my father's wood shop, and my best friend from childhood made a box from it that is directly modeled after the last thing that he made. He was really obsessed with this joinery that's happening in the corners, and you know, like a true artist, wouldn't Google it, had to figure it out himself. I think he spent 3 months figuring out this box, and this is a replication of that box. And when making this work, I really couldn't stop thinking about this feeling that kept coming up in helping my mom and my brothers process my dad's stuff. And I think anyone who's lost someone knows exactly what I'm talking about when you open the closet and you're like hit with that smell of them. And I just kind of became obsessed with that idea of how to preserve it. Am I wasting it? Am I imagining that it's him? Is it really the detergent? I don't know, I think I wrote a lot and thought a lot about that experience of the smell of what was left. And I took the first 9 shirts that I rescued from the donation pile, and I cut them up and folded them into this, I don't know, kind of like topography of his clothing. And at the time that I made this, I was working at a packaging job where it was my job to take labels, like clothing labels, out of boxes and put them into cardboard sleeves. And every time I opened the box, I was really struck by how quilt-like the patterning and the colors were, and I wanted to investigate that with clothing that belonged to him. And I really love the idea of this piece, of if the shirts stay in this configuration, that in 10 years and 20 years, there will still be this like evidence of him there. This piece is titled Mama, and it is made from 2 separate woven fabrics. So the blue kind of open fabric that's hanging around the chestnut broom handle is one piece of fabric, and then the white kind of limp fabric is a separately woven one. And the structure of these cloths is really similar. They're both a double weave fabric, which if anybody is a weaver in here, you know this. But for double weave, you are simultaneously weaving 2 layers of cloth at the same time. And I liked thinking about that metaphor for me and my father. You know, these things that are always out of sync, but that are literally cut from the same cloth. And yeah, this piece I was thinking about a parent and a child once it was off the loom. They are kind of the same structure, but the blue being kind of what is passed down. I was also struck by, it took me a long time to figure out the configuration of this sculpture, and whenever I installed it this way, I was struck by the Pieta sculpture and kind of this like limp figure with a suspension happening above it. This piece is also a double woven work. It's called Soft Landing. And something that's really fun, just thinking like process-wise, weaving-wise, whenever you're doing a double weave, you have these 2 layers of cloth so you can stuff them. And this is stuffed with recycled clothing. And this is one of the only pieces in the exhibition in which I kind of interrogated or manipulated the surface of the wood itself. So in the bottom left corner, there's kind of this pocket that has been cut out and then carved into the wood. Again, kind of thinking towards this like isolation within a system, or even as simple as like the disruption of a unit or the family unit. This is another double weaving. And yeah, this piece was made in reference to some really amazing Southern Appalachian quilts that I was studying as research for this work. And it also incorporates elements from drawings I was making at this time. I was making this series of really simple drawings that were rectangles that just had these squares of negative space, either represented by being cut or colored in, and then sometimes like the squares from one drawing would emerge in another drawing. And I kind of kept like questioning as I was making that work, what is this about? Like, why am I making this? And I think that as I started to incorporate it into my woven work, it felt really like this like symbiosis of my reflection of my family unit that was deteriorating. Yeah, and thinking about those drawings, this piece is related to that as well. This is called 365, and I was really lucky on the anniversary of my father's passing, which was this past May. I was in residence at Aeromont, and I kind of had the whole day to just reflect and make and think. And this piece of wood, kind of the plinth that's on the sawhorses, is the piece of wood that I found the first time I went into my dad's shop after he died. And it is literally this rectangular piece of wood that just has a square that's missing. And I felt like it was kind of this like assurance from him of like, you should do something with this. So on the anniversary, I used reclaimed clothing from him and also found material to wrap this piece of wood for a duration of 12 hours. And I think this felt, at the time, very historical and related to ancient burial practices of wrapping the body. But I also think conceptually, like, I'm very honest about the way I speak about my father. And I wanted this to almost be this like protection of him, because I still think there is that in there too, of wanting to protect him and his legacy and the way I talk about him, how his memory lives on. The next few pieces I'm going to talk about are drawings. And this work is titled By Another Name. I think one of the moments that I knew my relationship was pretty much severed with my father was when I got married. My husband and I got married in Ireland, and we were teaching English in Korea at the time, backpacked to Ireland, and then invited a bunch of friends and family to join us. And I always imagined that my dad would be there, and he wasn't. He did not get his passport in time. And it was kind of like one of those things that I like knew the whole time. He probably wasn't going to be there. And whenever I returned home, he presented me with this cutting board that he had spent the last 6 months making that was referencing the Southern Appalachian quilt pattern called tumbling blocks. And my dad was a smart man. I don't think he did that by accident. I think this idea of tumbling blocks or entropy was intentional. I think he knew that he had made this grave mistake that, in his way, I think he was making up for with this labor of love. And yeah, the bottom right composition, there is this kind of like interruption of the pattern there because, yeah, again, kind of antagonizing that idea of the family unit or this pattern that is set in its way. This work is titled Limitation of Instinct, and thinking again about like personal imagery or personal metaphor, I saw a TikTok of an ant mill. Has anybody seen an ant mill footage of it? It's crazy. Yeah, and if you haven't seen it, YouTube it. It's essentially where army ants, their pheromones get confused, and they, instead of following a line to and from their colony, they follow one another until they die, they collapse and they die. And the title of this is from the first scientific observation of this, in which the scientist said, there seems to be a limitation of this instinct. And I, even though this is like a little bit of like a darker subject matter, I really wanted to make a piece about the perpetuation of hurtful, harmful patterns and the recognition of when those need to be stopped. Yeah, really kind of largely about the capacity to break patterns. Yeah, and I think I've been thinking a lot about ants, specifically fire ants, as kind of this collective animal, and I think that this subject matter is something that I'll return to in the future. This work is titled Snag, and I wanted to include this because I do not have a story about this piece. I really just wanted to make a weaving of my backyard, and I think it's okay to make art for art's sake. Yeah. This piece is titled Lockstep, and after I made this, I felt like this was kind of a turning point in my work. Even though I just made it a couple months ago, I really feel like a lot of the work I'm making now is in this same vein. I like that there's like an ambiguity here. I like that there are these big fat floats of a thread that I'm working with. And this piece is also referencing that last piece that my father made, the joinery. And I kind of like that there's this gesture of movement here. You're not sure if the joints are moving towards one another or away from one another. And I want to mention the pattern for this, so these big kind of like varying squares, that is an Appalachian overshot pattern. This is like a regional weaving pattern that was drafted, at least for the first documented time, in the early 19th century. This is another Appalachian overshot pattern, and this one is titled Heirloom, and this is another one that feels a little bit more personal. At my dad's funeral, I learned that that was the year that he had planted his first garden, like a couple of months prior. And it really struck me, it was really hard on me because that was the same year that I had my first garden. And I remember writing after, like, did we put our seeds in the ground at the same time? Like, almost thinking of it as this like missed opportunity or missed connection. But I think that as I've spent more time with this work, it kind of feels similar to the 365 piece. It feels almost like this assurance that something good was passed down from him. And yeah, I want to talk technically for just a moment. So I have been talking about Southern Appalachian overshot patterns, and I know that's like quite the mouthful. I want to just like illustrate that a little bit more. So in overshot weaving, you are able to make these really beautiful kind of optical illusion-based designs. And technically that happens because one of your threads that's running horizontally is skipping over many, many threads. So the purple thread is skipping over these like really large areas of what's called work thread. And I think that like even down to like the granular level of this work, it's still about absence and about loss. And because that purple pattern thread is jumping over such big areas, there has to be this supplemental thread that's holding everything together. Yeah, there is like a repercussion for this absence that's happening. And I think that one of the pieces that I think speaks most to that idea while also thinking culturally about the idea of loss is this piece called Lee's Surrender. And this piece is made, again, referencing 19th century woven coverlets. So this style of blanket in the 19th century was functional and would be seen on a domestic bed. And the pattern that is used, so this pattern here, is literally called Lee's Surrender, and we don't know much about it other than when it was written. We don't know who made it, and there is one of my favorite like Southern material culture scholars is Eliza Calvert Hall, and she has this essay where she's writing to the pattern, and she's asking, were you made in sorrow or were you made in triumph? And I think that idea of like posing this question to continue this conversation as makers in Southern Appalachia, of continuing the conversation of the history on which the land that we are making on is something that I'm thinking about a lot with this body of work. And the central image is a photograph that's woven of the McLean house, which is the actual site of Robert E. Lee's surrender, next door to the Appomattox Courthouse. And I think in this political climate where there is misinformation and abbreviated facts for the sake of digestion, it is important for us as artists to be these historians and to be these archivists that are kind of like asking these questions and reintegrating the history of the material upon which we're commenting on. There is one little nugget in this too. If anyone is a quilter, the piecing method for this is called courthouse steps, and we're told that Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, so just a little week for y'all. Okay, I want to switch gears really quick to talk about some older work. So before the body of work that I just showed you, before Threshold, I was hand dyeing and hand weaving my own denim compositions on a floor loom, which were all in this show called Something in the Water. And I was really exploring denim as kind of this symbol of American idealized labor. This is a piece called The Whole World at Your Fingertips, The Ocean at Your Door, which is taken from a quote from Bo Burnham's Inside, if anybody remembers that film. And yeah, I think this was kind of a moment in my practice where I was deciding formally what I wanted my language to be, how I was going to be speaking with positive and negative space that I think informed the work that you just saw. And yeah, technically this work is really this interrogation of the woven system using that twill structure that we looked at a few minutes ago. There's that net again. This piece is using the same process of incorporating the twill, denim structure, and yeah, the structure of this cloth, this kind of like gaping space of blue, there's no weaving there. So there is no structural integrity of this cloth. Kind of again, thinking about like, what are the repercussions of the absence within this system? This piece is called The Animal That Became God, and it is kind of fusing hand-woven denim with manufactured denim as well. And this is one of the only works that are in this, it's in this presentation, but I've made a lot of work with bleach. Again, kind of speaking to my religious childhood, using something that is seemingly harmless, but is, it may be even like seen as beneficial, but it's ultimately really caustic and will eventually eat through the fabric itself. And the imagery here is, one hand is from the creation of Adam, and the other is the sculpture outside of the Chernobyl factory. Going back even further in time, I started denim with deconstruction processes, and I was really going down these rabbit holes about American salvage denim. I don't know if anybody here is a denim head, but the American salvage denim industry is pretty much dead. There's one mill in Louisiana, but at the time that this work was made, I made everything in this one and the next one I'm going to show you, from one of the last bolts of fabric from Cone Denim Mills in North Carolina. And this was one of the first times that I was using a net imagery in my work. And yeah, there's a fiber scholar named Elizabeth Whalen Barber, and she kind of like jokingly is asking in a lot of her writing, there's the Bronze Age, there's the Iron Age, what about the Fiber Age? Like, why are we not talking about nets? Why are we not talking about snares and harnesses? So I was thinking a lot about her writing when making this work initially with the net. And then this piece, serendipitously, is actually the first piece I made about my father, called Far From the Tree, also made with that selvage denim from Cone Denim Mills. This installation is where I met Tom. This is at the Bascom Center for Visual Arts in Highlands, North Carolina. And the kind of overarching concept for this work was all about the ravel. So in a fabric where there is a ravel, it's either this undoing or this in process circumstance. And I wanted to make work that was both. So in some of these, there is like additive processes, and some there's subtractive, and most there's both. And this work was made in response to the 7 days of biblical creation. Again, going back to my Southern evangelical upbringing, but kind of interrogating it through this zeitgeist lens of what we're doing to the planet. Some older work, this is called Undulation from Far Away. And I mentioned earlier that I backpacked. I was really lucky to get the chance to go to a Thai garment factory while I was backpacking, and this was some of the scrap shirting fabric that they had. And this piece is, it's pieced together using water-soluble thread and installed in front of a humidifier. So over the course of the exhibition, the piece actually disintegrates and falls apart. The fabric is still left, but the joining pieces evaporate. Thinking about my thesis work, so in grad school I really didn't weave very much at all. I was pushed to use a lot of found material and ready-made material, which I think honestly, as frustrated as I was by that at the time, I think it got my work to where I want it to be now. And a lot of that work was about globalized labor and thinking about quote-unquote women's work in and outside of the home. And yeah, deconstruction really began here for me, like thinking about a way to point to labor in a way that was reciprocating the making. And this piece is called Getting the Spots Out, where I used a found polka dotted bedsheet and hand cut all the polka dots out except for one. And this piece actually kind of blends into the wall when you see it, like in person. It's kind of hard to even like tell that it's there, and I think that perfectly comments on this idea of like invisible labor enacted in the home that I was making work about at that time. This piece is titled Creel and is made from a cotton blanket that was gifted to my mother from my grandmother, and then my mom gifted to me. And I wanted this to kind of be this portrait of this matrilineal relationship and its imperfections. There are just a couple more pieces that I want to talk about. This one is titled 6 Miles in 60 Hours. And I wanted this piece to kind of, I was thinking a lot about Robert Morris and Box with the Sound of Its Own Making. I wanted the title to kind of give this nugget of information about process in this. Did y'all know there are 6 miles of yarn in the average t-shirt? So that is what the first part of the title is referencing, and it took me 60 hours to unknit this, including the garment tag itself. Yeah, and I was really beginning to think about kind of like process as a material in this body of work. This one is called Love Is, and this came from the question of like what in the contemporary garment industry is still done by hand. And although the fabric is made primarily with automated machines, the tension for the seams and the collar still has to be regulated by the human hand. So I had this series of works that were kind of like these skinned t-shirts that I thrifted these and I left the garment tags on them and the sales tags on them to kind of like track this circulation of labor and value throughout the capitalist system. This work, I want to end on this one because I made this out of grad school, right after grad school, after I didn't weave for a couple of years, and I felt like I was getting away with something. I wanted to weave so badly, and I wasn't really weaving in grad school, and this is using an Appalachian overshot pattern with t-shirts. So I want to just end on this piece because if you want to make the thing, just make the thing. I wish I would have made this earlier, but I think that it kind of is this like full circle moment where it's like uniting the older work with the work that I'm making now. I want to end with just a few quick things. My current work, what I'm currently embarking on, is a research project where I'm doing kind of a deep dive of the Southern Appalachian weaving patterns, and what makes this really fun is that there is almost no information. So there is a lot of like word of mouth accounts of how a pattern got into the Southern material culture vernacular, but not a lot of like origin stories of where they came from, which is really fun for putting all the information together. And I think also it allows for a lot of speculation and fictionalizing about these patterns. So that's what I'm working on right now. I am also working on an exhibition that will be at the Appalachian Center for Craft next fall. And that is kind of really leaning into this idea of individualism and interdependence, really through the lens of like bootstrapping, the idea of bootstrapping. So yeah, stay tuned for that. When I'm not teaching and making, I run a weaving residency out of the shared studio space on my property. It's called Tabby Studio. Yeah, if you want to follow along. this is there, and it's also like in the same valley where weavers have been for many generations. So it feels very kismet to be working with weavers in this space. The last lecture I gave, the students asked for a reading list at the end. So I don't know if y'all are keen on that, but if you are, there's a QR code that has all of the books that I mentioned in my talk and then some that I didn't. Yeah, and if you miss it, I can email it to you. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Hi. Yeah, go for it.
How do you choose your fiber? Like, I know there's a lot of blue and red color, but are you looking for like cotton, linen?
Yeah, I think I primarily work with cotton, and I'm starting to use a lot more wool in my work because I'm spinning some of the yarn as well. But primarily sticking with the traditional coverlet yarns, which are cotton and wool. Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, I love how you're like weaving together, I mean, symbolically both your narrative, the cultural narrative that we're in together during this period of time in Southern Appalachians in this political period. And then having that within your work. And I wonder, like, if you were to prompt everyone in the room with their artistic practice, what would be a question that you would have people explore within themselves as they contextualize their art process within these times that we're in?
Man, that's heavy. I think like right now, I'm thinking a lot about the idea of myth, and not as necessarily this like grand story that we're told, but like sneaky myths that sneak their way into our understanding of place and one another. So maybe like something about that, like what myths are you still hanging on to from childhood? Or maybe what myths are you hanging on to that shape your view of the place that you live? I don't know, that's a really good question. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is super wonky. It's about the piece you showed towards the beginning of your talk, The Stranger in the House.
Yeah.
The shadows. I was trying to figure out how you created those shadows.
Yeah, let's see if we can go back.
Because it looked like, my brain just wasn't making sense of that.
Yeah, so there are the two like weird spaces are actually negative space cut into the quilt, and then the black streak that you're seeing, I think it's just like a shadow of how they photographed it. But yeah, I think there's like this very frequent like coupling in my work that happens, and thinking again about that relationship between me and my father. I think that's kind of what those spaces are representing. But yeah, process-wise, it's just a clip of them.
It's amazing because it looks like those are shadows of something that's not there. That's what I
like that.
was.
It's like a void that's filled up.
Yeah. And then the second question is more of a life question about, you mentioned that you had gone to Korea to teach English, and that led you various places in life. But I was just wondering kind of how you, were you already on the track to become an artist at that point, and was this just kind of something that you thought of doing as a way to explore the world, or how did that all come about?
Yeah, I feel like it was a really formative time in my life that I don't really know like how much context to give in like a presentation like this, but I think in like a normal conversation it would be one of like the first things I would say. I went immediately after grad school. I think I had like an identity crisis after grad school, like what am I doing? And yeah, I went and taught kindergarten, taught English there for a year, and then kind of like traveled my way home. Which I'll just make a blanket statement. If any of you don't know what to do after school, go teach English. It was amazing. Yeah, I got to like see so much of the world and I saved so much money. It was great. But while I was there, I think I like immediately realized I couldn't make work the way I was in grad school, obviously. And I wanted to kind of like, I wanted to immerse myself into the culture while still doing what felt natural. So I took a Korean sewing class from a Korean bourgeoisie master. And I went to her house 2 days a week, and she did not speak English and I spoke very little Korean. And I think having that experience immediately after grad school, you know, where, you know, your head's so big and you think you're so smart, and then having to like watch someone like a child and relearn this process, it was really, really humbling, and I think connected me to fiber in this way that I had kind of forgotten about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I saw a hand. Yeah.
It's kind of a basic question, but I noticed you use a lot of blue, and when you use blue, you also use orange. Is like there a reason behind it?
Yeah, I think I started using blue in my work after graduate school when I started using a lot of denim, and I was indigo dyeing a lot of my fiber at that time. So a lot of it is by like necessity or by like proxy of what material I have from that. But I also think that there is this like very Americana quality of blue that I think, especially in correspondence with my older work that's red and white, that I want to kind of continue this conversation of. And something about weaving with blue, I think that like, let me see if I can get to the piece. Like the Leave Surrender piece, it almost like puts you in a trance when you see it because the blues are so deep in person. And yeah, I think like formally I'm just really interested in kind of this like monochrome of like the contrast of the color now, but it did really start with like the indigo plant itself. Yeah, oh, and orange, yeah, I mean, I think I am someone who was really bad at color theory when I was in school, and I think like blue and orange, that's like one of the things I took from that. But I also think like with this body of work, thinking about these entities on opposite ends of the spectrum, I did kind of want there to be this like color palette that was centered on those two seemingly opposite but also perfectly fusible colors together.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's really good advice you just gave about like post school, you know, teach or just travel. You know,
Yeah.
kind of either put into action or erase what you learn. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but the question I have is about, I'd love to hear you talk more about how like your this weaving collective.
Mm-hmm.
Tabby, what was it?
Yeah, Tabby
yeah.
Studio.
Yeah, so how did that come about? Who you work with?
Yeah, it's really just me and my husband and a friend whenever we need some extra instructors, but I love teaching. Specifically, I love teaching weaving, and I was really lucky with the property that we live on. There are two houses, and they were the definition of fixer-upper houses, and we've put in a lot of work, and one of the houses is just like this perfect studio space. Has this really large, open, very well-lit room, and I was actually teaching a class at Warren Wilson, and I was kind of just like blabbering about, you know, academia, blah, 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 and one student was like, don't you like have space to just have people at your home? And I was like, oh my god, yes. So they kind of like planted this seed, and then all of these looms just like found their way to me. And so yeah, in the summer months from June to September, we host a series of weavers, and we have 3 different programs. So the first one is for people who have never touched a loom that want to learn how to start their own weaving practice, folks that need a refresher, and then people who are fully independent. So it's like a really good variety of skill level and interest level, and it's really kind of like established this little regional community of weavers, which has been really fun to kind of see unfold. Last year was our first year, and then we had like a pilot season, so this will be our second full year doing it. So it's very new, but yeah, it's really, really amazing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'd like to visit.
Yeah, come on out.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, well thank you guys so much. Happy Halloween.